BUCKSKIN and BLACKBOARD by Phyllis M. Taylor. Chapter 1. From Malvern Hills to Rocky Mountains. I stood on the pavement, savoring the strangeness of the place, ringed with the treeless gray-green mountains. I watched an eagle flying over a mountain top. I heard the swish of the waves in the Thompson River, rushing below on its way to the Fraser, and the clanging bell of the freight train passing through a few yards away on tracks level with the roadway. I smelt the all-pervading scent of the sage. This was the threshold of adventure, and I knew it. The despondency of recent years slipped from me, and I felt again that tingling sense of anticipation, which is generally the prerogative of youth. The conductor's announcement that we were running into Ashcroft had awakened me from sleep. A few moments later, I had stepped off the Canadian Transcontinental bus into the chill morning air of this mountain village. Inside the bus office, I asked if anyone could give me the address of the school board secretary, though 5 o'clock in the morning was rather early for a social call. "You want Nick Mattick," they said. "Sure, we'll ring him up for you." They took off the receiver and said, "Give me Nick Mattick." "No, he won't be at his office at this time of day. Try the house." After a brief conversation, they told me that Nick was in bed, but would be down to meet me in a few minutes. In due course, he arrived in a big Oldsmobile car. He used a crutch, and I was told later that he had left a leg on the Normandy beaches. I learned that I was still 80 miles or more from my school, but nobody seemed to be in a particular hurry for me to get there, and I spent a leisurely day around town. Nick was a 6-footer, and, like all men in the neighborhood, wore a 10-gallon hat. This was cowboy country. He took me to his home, and I had breakfast with his wife and family. Then we discussed the terms of my appointment as a rural teacher. I found my rate of pay was double what I had received in England, and as my allowance was now almost exhausted, I was very glad to receive an advance of $100 out of my first month's pay. There were certain prohibitions which I must observe. I must not, for instance, expound Scripture to my pupils, though I was required to recite with them the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of morning school, and to read the appropriate passage of the Bible prescribed for the day. If I found it necessary to give corporal punishment, I was restricted to the use of the strap provided by the school board. Later in the day, we went to the hotel where I was to spend a couple of nights. This came up to expectations magnificently. Besides the tourists traveling by car who stopped there for meals, there were cowboys and Indians slopping in and out in colorful attire, and old men sitting ranged in chairs along one wall within reach of the spittoon. In the evening, when 4 cowboys abreast came wheeling round the corner of the street in a cloud of dust and leapt from their horses, I was ready to drop behind the nearest piece of furniture, anticipating gunplay. But the modern cowboy carries a gun only to shoot the coyotes. It was difficult to distinguish cowboys from Indians in many cases. They were both equally bronzed and wore the same kind of clothes, and I was thrilled by them all. Ashcroft, on a summer day, is a very pleasant place, no matter how hot it is. There is always a breeze blowing up from the galloping waters of the Thompson River. The sandy streets are bordered by wooden sidewalks leading to neat white houses whose wide-open windows are screened by wire gauze and shaded by colorful awnings. In the gardens, rotating hoses play on the lawns. There is a well-stocked Chinese store at one end of the town, where courteous and efficient service is given, and the accounts are reckoned by an ancient Chinese man using an abacus. The Chinese and Indian and white children play together in the dust, and the teenagers, wearing the latest American-style jeans and checked shirts, lounge about the stores or wait at the station for their piles of newspapers when the transcontinental train is due. At the other end of the town, there is a tomato canning factory, which provides summertime employment for many of the Indians in the area. The field tomatoes grown near Ashcroft are enormous, sweet, juicy fruit, and the local housewives bottle their own for use during the winter. Miss Mattick took me to meet John and Monica, two young English friends of hers. John had been stationed in Canada during the war and had decided to take up the practice of law there after he married, so Monica had brought the two children out, and they had made their home in Ashcroft. We took the children for a walk along the river bank. I found that here you could not wear open-toed sandals because of the little cushions of prickly pear cactus which abounded. It was wiser also to keep to the path, since we were on the borders of rattlesnake country. The next morning, Miss Mattick took me shopping. Although her husband had expressed no misgivings about my suitability for this rural post, I could see that she had some apprehension on my behalf. I came to appreciate this when I had had some experience of the sort of life I was embarking upon. But for the moment, ignorance was bliss, and the fact that I knew nothing of the art of cooking, for instance, that I had never had to cope with a wood-burning stove, or any other sort of stove, and had no practical knowledge of how to roast a joint or bake a cake, did not daunt me. At Miss Mattick's recommendation, I bought a huge box of groceries, luxuries. They seemed to me, after the years of rationing in England, and a pressure cooker, and these were loaded into the boot of the car, which was to take me out to my new school the following morning. We left Ashcroft soon after breakfast, Nick and I, John and Monica, the groceries, and stacks of old newspapers put in by Miss Mattick. I wondered if these were included to provide reading material for me. Across the river, the road twisted and spiraled above the Thompson Canyon. Sometimes the car went swinging so perilously near the edge of the precipice that I trembled lest we should meet a bus coming unexpectedly round the corner. The next time I traveled by this road was when I was on my way out to Vancouver at Christmas time. Then I was in the bus coming down the mountain in the dark, and as we turned a corner, we suddenly saw the tiny points of the street lights of Ashcroft far below us, sparkling in the frosty air, crisscrossing in lines at right angles, like the dotted lines of a map grid. Now we were soaring upwards until the gradient leveled out, and a few miles further on we came to Cache Creek on the old Caribou Trail. All that remains now to link it with the Gold Rush days is the exhibit set out by the roadside, the wagon wheels and other relics, and the picture postcards in the little store. The trail is now a superhighway to Clinton, 100-Mile House, Quesnel, and the north. The big car purred away the miles alongside the Bonaparte River, past rolling ranch lands, overtaking occasional Indians on horseback. The countryside was becoming more forested, and colored rocks shining in the sunlight bordered the road. After about 40 miles, we left the main road at the approach to the town of Clinton, which Nick said would be my nearest shopping center. I asked how far we were from Big Bar Creek, and he said about 50 miles. But they were no ordinary 50 miles. We were traveling on a narrow earth road that did not run straight for more than a few yards at a time, bordering lakes, climbing through little gorges, shut in by forest, opening into clearings, where a group of log cabins labeled perhaps L&P or Circle H indicated a guest ranch for hunters who came in the fall in search of deer and moose, and as the journey progressed, encircled by endless miles of forested mountain ranges. I was seething with excitement. If a deer or a bear had crossed our path, the picture would have been complete, but I had to be content with the sight of whitened moose antlers lying among the berry patches, and by an unexpected meeting with 3 real cowboys dressed authentically in Stetsons, chaps, and spurs, with lariats slung on the saddle horns. At 4,000 feet above sea level, we came upon a little oasis of smiling meadows and picturesque log buildings, known as Jesmond, or the Mountain House. Here the Coldwell family, Mr. and Miss Coldwell Sr., with their son Pete, and his wife and young family, run a guest ranch, cattle ranch, store, and post office. I made a mistake in pronunciation, which had to be corrected. I referred to the ranch, and was told that hereabouts the pronunciation is ranch, the A as in and. A ranch is maintained by the wealth of its owner. A ranch, on the other hand, has to maintain its owner in a style according to the amount of work he puts into it. And ranching is very hard work indeed. Mr. Coldwell, who emigrated from Newcastle upon Tyne about 40 years ago and built up the business through the years, took down my grocery order. He explained that Pete brought mail and groceries down the valley of Big Bar Creek once a week on Thursday mornings, and took outgoing mail back with him. There was a party telephone line connecting Jesmond with Clinton, but as my school was 11 miles down the valley, and I had no means of transportation, I wondered what I should do in an emergency. We now set off on the last lap of the journey. My mind had been so much stimulated by the variety of scenery presented by the trip so far that I was prepared for anything. A few 100 yards beyond Jesmond, the road forked. To the right lay the OK Ranch, and far beyond, Gang Ranch to the left, the valley of Big Bar Creek. Now I was getting near home, and I sat up with renewed interest to survey the country. For a mile or so, the road ran fairly level, bordered by the interminable forest. Then it began to drop suddenly, and in a succession of horrifying curves, it descended rapidly to straighten out at the bottom alongside green pastures and an occasional log cabin. We swung round yet another curve of the mountain road, and Nick stopped the car abruptly. In the road ahead of us was an Indian boy, 10 or 11 years old, in a blue shirt and broad-brimmed hat, astride a big buckskin horse. The pair of them made such a picture in the golden light of the afternoon sun that I was filled with delight. "Hello, Michael," said Nick. "This is your new teacher. She's come all the way from England." Michael gave a nod of acknowledgment and scrutinized me with a long, silent look, making no response to my greeting. When we had passed, I said, "If all my pupils are as picturesque as that one, I am going to be very lucky." The valley now widened, though it was still enclosed by mountain ranges. The bed of the creek, down across the sage on our left, was marked by the lush growth of willows, poplars, and chokecherry trees. "Now," said Nick, "when we turn the next corner, look down to the left, and you will see the school." I leaned forward eagerly. The car churned up the gravel as it swung round again, and I looked down towards the creek. Deep in the bowl of the Green Mountains was a cluster of log buildings, the barn, the long, low schoolhouse, and the teacherage. We bumped down the track to the door, and Nick gave me the keys. We made our way through the sage and the rioting tumbleweed which choked the path, and I turned the key in the lock of the first house that had ever been mine. Inside the house, I saw the rough wooden table and bench, the row of shelves against the wall, the linoleum square on the floor, the 2 windows with sills the depth of the logs. I went through the archway into the next room and saw the iron-framed double bedstead, the old desk for a dressing table, the recess for hanging clothes. That was what my eye saw, but my mind leapt ahead, furnishing the windows with sprigged muslin curtains, the shelves with gay crockery and shining pans, the clothes closet and the doorway with softly draped hangings, painting the woodwork a shining white and staining the floor dark brown, but I did not linger. There was still the school to see. Leaving my companions, exclaiming with horror at the condition of the house, I ran across to the school and stood amazed. I felt as if I was the victim of a fantasy. Here were books and ink pots, blackboards and chalks, pens, pencils, and rulers, map desks and cupboards, but one glance through the windows proclaimed the fact that civilization was scores of miles away. I felt completely isolated, as though I was going to teach school on a desert island, inhabited by no one but me and the children. I drew my finger through the dust on top of a desk and wondered what I should achieve here, but there was no time to dream. Back at the cabin, work was in full swing. My predecessor had left 2 months earlier, and it was obvious that since then the pack rats had been in possession. Chewed bedding was strewn all over the floor among remnants of stale food, and the pungent smell of the animals was hard to get rid of. We all set to work. Forthwith, John stripped to the waist and took the axe out to the wood pile. Nick picked up a couple of pails and set out to hack his way through the undergrowth to the creek. Monica donned an apron, and we started spring cleaning. When the water was boiling, we washed dishes and cutlery, and furniture and floors. John now had a mountain of wood chopped, and he brought it into the house in armfuls and stacked it neatly close to the stove. Nick went down the valley in the car to spread the news that the teacher had arrived, and he returned laden with gifts: eggs and butter and milk, marrows and lettuces and tomatoes, apples and cabbages and corn, bottled raspberries and jam. By this time, bacon and tomatoes were sizzling in our frying pan, and we had our first meal since breakfast. When we had finished, dusk was approaching, and my visitors had to set out on their long return journey. I stood in the cabin doorway and watched the car out of sight. When there was no longer even the hum of the engine to be heard, I experienced a momentary panic. Here I was, marooned thousands of miles from my friends, surrounded by emptiness and silence, dependent on my own resources, knowing nothing about the peculiar difficulties of the job. I gave myself a shake and went indoors to unpack. Chapter 2. The Log Cabin Teacherage. There was not much I could do in the way of unpacking, as there were no drawers or hooks to accommodate my clothing. I went over to the school and collected a pile of records and reports to study so that I could have some idea of the capabilities of the children. I read the names in the attendance register. They were all either Grinders or Higginbottoms, except for Michael, whose surname was Dunn. That would be the boy on the buckskin horse. Perhaps he was not a native of the valley. The confidential report cards contained information on academic achievements. The 12 pupils, ranging in age from 6 years to 15 years, were distributed over 6 different grades or classes. All except the youngest children had been given standardized intelligence tests, and their intelligence quotients were recorded. My heart sank when I saw how low in the scale they all rated. Mental retardation, I knew from experience, is apt to go hand in hand with behavior difficulties. I prepared myself for the worst. I was thankful to find some recipes printed on the pages of a calendar hanging on the wall, and I used one of these forthwith, making an egg custard for my meal the next day. Milk was in powdered form, mixed with the ice-cold water from the creek. It was delicious. With the lettuce and cucumber and tomatoes my unknown friends had sent me, and the cheese and biscuits from my grocery box, I imagined I should do well enough. I kept finding excuses for going outside and standing on the mountainside, marveling at this translation from the hurly-burly of city life to the silence of the mountains. Yet it was not complete silence. There was always the accompanying sound of the waters of the creek, like the roar of the sea. It was the relief from the strident voice of civilization which I found so refreshing. Inside my house was snug, and I went to bed early, tired out by the long drive and the vigorous scrubbing of the afternoon. I lay for a while in the darkness, recalling some of the kaleidoscopic pictures of the last few days. I thought of my home on the Malvern Hills, where a new day would already have dawned. I looked forward to the new life which would begin tomorrow, and with a sense of happy anticipation, I fell asleep. Suddenly, I was awake, wide-eyed and alert. In a flash of recollection, I realized that I had forgotten to lock the door when I went to bed. What had awakened me? What time was it? I lay tense in the darkness. What was that dark shape against the wall? Had somebody walked into my house? I strained my eyes in the darkness to see if I could detect any movement. I said aloud, "Is somebody there?" And my voice startled me. After a few minutes, I relaxed. I reached for the matches and lit my little paraffin chimney lamp. The dark shape turned out to be my coat hanging from a nail. I went over and locked the door. My alarm clock said 2:30, and got into bed again. Just as I was falling asleep, an extraordinary noise began above my head. It sounded as if a troop of circus animals was galloping backwards and forwards across my ceiling. I decided that the pack rats, or chipmunks, were having a field day, and shouted at the top of my voice to scare them. But the scuttering, scrabbling, galloping continued, and I stuffed the blanket into my ears and went to sleep. The morning sunshine woke me early, and I lay listening to other peculiar sounds, heavy clumping and snuffling sounds outside. Looking cautiously through my uncurtained windows, I saw horses grazing among the sage. The kitchen fire had been out for hours, but it was soon roaring again, and I had finished breakfast and was washing my dishes on the bench by my open doorway when I saw a group of children coming up the trail towards the school. When Nick had gone down the valley to announce my arrival, I had asked him to appeal for volunteers to help scrub out the school the next day. Being the first Monday in September, this was a public holiday, and school did not start until Tuesday. 4 children were approaching, 2 girls and 2 boys. They wore gay red or blue shirts and jeans and introduced themselves with spirit. "We're the 4 grinders," said Marjorie, the eldest. "This is Floyd. He's just starting school. He's 6. "No, I ain't. I'm 7, said Floyd. "You're not. You're 6, the others repeated. "I'm Viva," said the little girl, a bright, dimpled 8-year-old. "And this is Ralph." "Hi," said Ralph. I hid a smile and said, "Good morning, children." We spent a busy morning, sorting and arranging books. There were dozens of different sets of readers, and library books, and history and geography books, and I had yet to discover which were in current use. The children went to play in the bushes by the creek for a time before going home, and I was preparing my cheese salad when Floyd and Ralph reappeared. "Hey, teacher," called Floyd. "You got a dish?" "A dish," I said, wondering what he wanted it for. "Yes, I think I can find one," and I produced a plate off the shelf. "He's got a trout," said Ralph. "Do you like trout?" My eyebrows lifted as Floyd opened a slimy fist and put on the plate a trout 7 or 8 inches long. "How did you get that?" I said in amazement. "Caught him in the creek," said Floyd. "Do you know how to clean it?" asked Ralph. "I think so," I said doubtfully. "Got a sharp knife?" asked Ralph, and he slit it up the belly and pulled out the insides. Floyd opened its stomach. "Gee, look," he said. "That's the grasshopper I fed him." I thought to myself, there can't be much wrong with the intellects of these children. I was on the lookout for my new pupils the next morning, when they came galloping down the trail in their broad-brimmed cowboy hats. They tethered their horses in the barn, or left them to graze freely on the mountain side, and came over to be introduced. There were only 5 of them that I had not already met, 3 Higginbottoms, Edgar, Douglas, and Dick, and 2 grinders of a different family, Minnie and Arthur. Relationships seemed to be rather complicated. Minnie was Edgar's aunt, though a year younger than he. Dick, at 7 years of age, was starting school for the first time. Fred Grinder and Pete Higginbottom were missing. Both were working on one or other of the ranches. I was rather relieved about Pete's absence. His IQ was exceptionally low, and I expected him to be a trial to me. My first job was to explore the capabilities of my pupils, so I set them to working arithmetical problems from their textbooks while I went round from one to another to see how they tackled them. Behavior was decorous, and the whole group was working quietly when Douglas created a diversion. "There's a rat in the cupboard," he said. I looked at him suspiciously and asked, "How do you know?" "I can hear it," said Douglas. We all listened. There certainly was a rustling sound. "Get a weapon," I said. They all fell out of their desks, grabbed the nearest lump of wood, or poker, or pencil box, and streaked for the back of the room. Edgar cautiously turned the knob and jerked the cupboard door open. For a moment there was no sign of a rat. Then Douglas spotted the tip of its tail. "There he is," he said, and a barrage of blows rained down. The rat dodged the blows and leapt out of the cupboard. Any other children of my acquaintance would have fled screaming, but not so these children. There was a wide strip of light shining between the hinges of the open door, and the rat darted for this. Instantaneously, the children slammed back the door and broke its neck in the hinge. The speed of their reaction was further evidence to me of a lively and practical intelligence. There was a stout blue book on the teacher's desk entitled BC Program of Studies, in which the syllabus for the teaching of every subject in every grade was prescribed, the subject in each case being divided into units. The teacher was required to teach Unit 1 in the first week, Unit 2 in the second week, and so on. The lesson notes for some of the subjects were even formulated. I assumed that this system had been devised for the benefit of young teachers without experience, who might be in remote situations where they had no one on whom to call for advice. During that first week, at the end of the day's work, I would pace backwards and forwards along the mountainside, asking myself how one could teach 6 classes simultaneously in one room. I knew that Canadian girls went out straight from college to teach in rural schools, where there might be 30 or 40 children, with an age range as wide as mine. How on earth did they manage? In a 20-minute spelling period, for instance, you could not teach 6 different sets of spelling. If you set the children to work on their own and tested them in turn, you got some queer results. This was evidently what they had all been accustomed to doing, and they could score quite highly so long as I dictated the words in the same order as those in the book, because they had learnt them by sight. They did not know how to pronounce the words, and had no conception of the meaning or the use of some of them. I decided that this was not a very intelligent way of teaching spelling. When I came to study the English syllabus for Marjorie, who was 13 years old, I found that she was required to read The Lady of the Lake, which had been the prescribed textbook for grade 8 for some years, it seemed. The vocabulary of this work was quite beyond her, and I felt that if she was forced to read it, she would probably develop a distaste for good literature. So I wrote to the inspector, describing Marjorie's background and asking if I might substitute Uncle Tom's Cabin, explaining that I could not teach The Lady of the Lake with inspiration to a girl who would find it so difficult to understand the vocabulary. The inspector replied, saying that I would find that I needed more perspiration than inspiration in rural teaching, and referring me to the program of studies, which authorized the substitution of the Black Arrow by Robert Louis Stevenson if preferred. I found that this book was a story of the Wars of the Roses, and was even more unsuitable, and not realizing that the curriculum laid down in the program of studies was sacrosanct, I ordered the mill on the floss for her. The inspector also sent me standardized intelligence tests to administer to the younger children who had not had them before. So my 4 grade 1 and grade 2 pupils, Floyd and Dick and Douglas and Arthur, struggled with the type of puzzle which had been devised to test the intelligence of American city children. They had, for instance, to mark the prettiest, meaning the one which was conventionally acceptable, of 3 pictures of a house or of a baby, etc., since they had never seen a house with 3 windows upstairs and 2 down. They had to ponder, and their choice, if not conventional, was as good as anyone else's. They had to mark the correct clothing to fit the medium-sized of 3 dolls. If it had been a question of fitting the correct harness to a horse, they would not have had the slightest difficulty. But they were not familiar with dolls' clothing. The question which demanded the greatest concentration and the nicest judgment, however, was the one in which they were required to look at a picture, and then to look at a page containing jigsaw pieces, of which only some belonged to the picture, and put a mark on every piece which occurred in the original. The picture showed a boy in short pants sitting on a window sill next to a potted tulip, blowing bubbles from a clay pipe, with other toys strewn on the floor around him. The children pored over this, debating what the strange objects might be, and wasting many of the precious 30 seconds allowed for the completion of that part of the test. The results of the test, translated into intelligence quotient ratings for the 4 children, were 93, 71, 65, 62. There was a circular accompanying the test stating that children with IQ between 81 and 90 were to be considered dull, between 71 and 80 as borderline, and of 69 or under as feeble-minded. And so, according to instructions, I must assume that only one of the children was of normal intelligence. Of the other 3, one was on the borderline, and 2 were feeble-minded. This was a distortion of the facts. Intelligence has some relation to experience. It would have been as logical to set me the task of shooting a deer and classify me as feeble-minded because I could not find a deer to shoot. How could I damn a boy scholastically by entering on his confidential record card an IQ of 62, when I knew that he could use an axe with precision and effect, or cross the roaring waters of the creek on a slippery log, or herd a bunch of wayward cattle along the mountain side, anticipating their attempts to evade him with lightning judgment and expert horsemanship. I soon found there was a naturalness of expression among the children, which, though refreshing, was apt to be disconcerting. Whereas English children expected to be treated differently from adults simply because of the fact that they were children. My new pupils did not seem to recognize any difference between youth and age. If I imposed a prohibition on them, they demanded that I should observe the same prohibition myself. I decided this was a good thing, but my poise was shaken on the first occasion when I was challenged. I had been dissatisfied with the cleanliness of the exercise books and ordered the children to show me their hands. They looked at me questioningly, so I indicated that they were to hold their hands in front of them, palm uppermost. They did so in a wondering sort of way, and I went round to inspect. When I came to Douglas, I said sternly, "Douglas, you have not washed your hands this morning." "I did so," said Douglas indignantly. He peered at his hands, then glanced at mine. I had been having trouble with my ballpoint pen. "You have not washed yours," he said. His remark was not an impertinence. It was simply a statement of fact. It took them some time to get used to my expressions, too. One day they began to clutch at their clothing and pull it round their waists. I asked, "What on earth is the matter?" And they replied, "You said, 'Pull yourselves together.' If I saw a boy dreaming and said to him, 'Now get on,' he would find it difficult to restrain himself from murmuring, 'Give me a horse and I'll get on.' I was shocked at first to find that they referred to everyone in the valley by his or her Christian name. I found that this had some reason, however, since kinship relations were rather complicated, and it might not be appropriate to add a title, aunt or uncle. I had written my own name on the blackboard the first morning, and so was rather surprised when someone asked, "What is your name?" "My name is Miss Taylor," I replied. "We don't mean that," said Michael. "We mean your first name." "My first name is Miss," I said. "No," said Ralph, "we mean your given name." "We called the last teacher Fred," said Floyd. I said emphatically, "My name is Miss Taylor." The boys were particularly interested in the question of my authority. "What would you do if we did not do what you said?" asked Pete. "You will do as I say," I replied. "We might not," said Edgar. "What would you do?" asked Fred. "You couldn't lick us." "I could lick you if necessary," I said, "but you know you have to do what the teacher says." "But if we said we wouldn't," persisted Pete, "you couldn't make us." It occurred to me that the older boys probably resented having to obey a woman, so I explained that it would not be necessary for me to have to make them obey, since they would always know in their hearts that they ought to do what I demanded. Besides the professional difficulties which confronted me during the first few weeks there were also the difficulties of adjustment required by the isolation of my life. When the children had gone home at 3:30 in the afternoon, I was alone until 9 o'clock the next morning. Sometimes an Indian passed in the distance, driving a wagon and team up the mountain road. Sometimes a rancher's car or truck or a gleaming gray taxi from Clinton went down the valley, and the driver would give a honk and wave to me as he went by. But I had no one to talk to unless one of the children came riding by, looking for a wandering horse or cow. They rode with such ease and grace that I delighted to watch them. There was none of the artificial movement taught in schools of equitation. They either walked the horse or loped. In each case, their own movement was one with that of the horse. If they were riding on a saddle, not the pancake military saddle, but the Western saddle with a saddle horn in front for the rope, they had their stirrup leathers long, so that they seemed to be standing in the stirrup. I suppose they learnt to ride as soon as they learnt to walk, if not earlier. When Floyd was about to remount one day, I committed a grave breach of etiquette. He was only 6 years old, and the horse seemed so enormous in comparison with the little boy that I offered my linked hands as a step to enable him to mount. Floyd looked at me contemptuously. "I don't take help from women," he said witheringly, and he fetched a block of wood from the wood pile to put beside the horse, climbed onto it, and hurled himself onto his stomach across the horse's bare back. Then he wriggled into position and galloped off across the sage. I had not time in the evenings to visit the homes of my pupils. The moment school was out for the day, I began my chores, chopping wood, filling lamps, carrying water. I liked to linger over the water carrying. It was so pleasant under the golden green canopy of the yellowing cottonwood trees. These are tall trees, with smooth trunks and little leaves like poplars. I had asked the children if there was any likelihood that I might meet a bear on my morning and evening trips to the creek, and they had said not at this time of the year, but that the bears came around to eat the wild strawberries in June. After the chores, I prepared supper. This meal at 6 o'clock was the main meal of the day. There was not time in the 1-hour lunch break to do more than prepare a salad or heat a can of soup. But since I had to do all my cooking from recipes, it tended to be a slow process. After I had washed up my supper dishes, I was fully occupied until bedtime with the preparing of lessons for 6 classes in each subject, and the correcting of English and arithmetic exercises, and in the writing of letters. Since mail day came only once a week, it was easy to think there is plenty of time to write letters. But generally, on the night beforehand, there was such an accumulation of letter writing to be done that there was hardly time to eat. After school, on the second day, I broke my can opener. This was a serious domestic misfortune. Until I replaced it, I would go hungry. So I set out to see if I could borrow another one from the home of the 4 grinders, my nearest neighbors. Henry's place, as it was called, was about a mile down the road. The log cabin was set in a patch of cleared ground beside the creek and opposite to it, across the road, were chicken houses, corrals, and barns. There was a large garden surrounding the house, and when I arrived, Annie, Henry's wife, was standing among the corn and gathering the rich pods for the evening meal, while Viva and Floyd husked them. Annie was the young-looking mother of 8 children and the sister of Alfie Higginbottom. Annie sent one of the children into the house to find a can opener that I could borrow, and Ralph took me across the road to see the animals. The family were getting fresh milk at the moment from a cow that had just had a calf. She was lying in the straw while the hens gathered round her, picking insects from her hide and pecking the milk from her dripping teats. Before milking, Annie set the bull calf to suckle for a few minutes, in order, she said, to clean the teats. The cow's udder was black with sand flies. Behind the corral there was a mound a few feet tall, with a heavy wooden door leading into it. This was the root cellar, and Annie took me inside to show me her preserves. The cellar was formed from an excavation in the mountainside, the roof supported by logs and covered deeply with earth, as a sort of insulation against the cold in winter and the heat in summer. There were compartments full of potatoes and other vegetables, and apples and pears, and the shelves were loaded with jars of preserved peaches and plums, and with jars of salted salmon. I contrasted these with the English housewife's empty shelves, and told the children how lucky they were. Annie lent me a can opener, and I went home to prepare my supper. I had not been home more than a few minutes when Floyd and Ralph appeared, with a little tricycle, towing a wooden box in which Patsy, the collie dog, was riding. Ralph said, "Mom's sent you some salmon. I'll bet you never had salmon like this before. Mom and I caught him last night in the river." They handed me a parcel containing a big cut of lovely red salmon, just like the pictures on the tins. The 2 little boys sat there and ate an orange while Ralph directed the cooking. "Mom's going to take you fishing some day," he said. When they left, Patsy stepped delicately into the box and was driven home. The next evening, when I was filling my lamps, an old open car crammed with people came bumping down to my door. They introduced themselves as Johnny Grinder's kids, the brothers and sisters of Minnie and Arthur. They had brought me a new can opener from Jesmond. This was the night of the week when everybody in the valley who had the means of transportation went up to Jesmond to collect the mail, exchange the week's gossip, and buy their groceries. The stage truck left Clinton on Wednesday afternoon and brought our mail and freight as far as Jesmond. The driver stayed at the mountain house overnight, and the next day went on about 40 miles to Gang Ranch. Pete Coldwell drove the Jesmond stage truck down the valley of Big Bar Creek on Thursday morning with the goods that had come out from Clinton and the local grocery orders. So on Thursdays, in school, all ears were cocked for the sound of the distant truck's engine. The first one to pick up the sound would yell, "Stage!" and the boy who had been deputed to post my letters would leap out of his desk and hurl himself through the open door to go racing up the trail to the road. The truck stopped, and the cowboy driver got out and climbed into the back to hand down the bag of mail and the box of groceries. During the next hour, the truck went on down to Big Bar Ranch at the bottom of the valley, and on its way back again, it would pick up any more mail I might have for dispatch. That meant that I had a feverish time glancing through letters from the education office, for instance, that might need an immediate answer and writing replies, while at the same time keeping the schoolwork going. Sometimes the rancher, who was a school trustee, would bring my mail down with his on the Wednesday evening, and I could read it and enjoy it at leisure. This first Thursday, however, the stage truck left the road and came right down to my door, as it had on board some furniture sent down by Mr. Mattick to add to the amenities of my cabin, with a green armchair and a chest of drawers of plain, unvarnished wood. I felt I had something to build a home around. There were also cans of white and cream enamel paint, so I should have material to keep me occupied during the weekends. On Friday night, the week was over, and I went across from school with armfuls of work to do. By the time I had washed up my supper dishes, it was getting dusk, so I prepared to light my lamp, a handsome incandescent oil burner, which Nick and John had shown me how to operate. Once or twice I had been rather alarmed by the way in which the flame burst up when I turned the tap to release the vapor, but on this occasion the whole thing seemed to be enveloped in flame, which leapt right up to the ceiling. I thought it would explode at any moment, and I picked it up in the dishcloth and ran out to deposit it on the mountainside. In time the flame died down, but I dared not light it again, and I was very much annoyed at missing the chance to get on with my work. It was soon quite dark, so that there was nothing else for me to do but to go to bed. I was awakened some hours later by a thunderous knock on the door. I had forgotten to lock the door again. Startled and dazed with sleep, I called out, "Come in." I heard the kitchen door open and someone step inside. "What is the matter?" I asked. A man's voice replied, "I fell off my horse. I thought maybe you could help me." This was the first challenge to my backwoodsmanship. So I said, "Just a moment," lit my little bedside lamp, and putting on a wrap, went into the kitchen. There stood a dark, husky, healthy-looking Indian. "I'm little Johnny," he said, "one of Johnny Grinder's boys. You met me the other evening in the car." There had been 8 or 9 people in the car, and I did not remember him. "What is wrong?" I asked. "My horse shied and threw me," he said. I caught my leg on a snag. The last teacher used to have some bandages. I thought maybe you could help me." I said rather coldly, "Well, sit down and take off your boot." "There's nothing wrong with my ankle," he replied. "It's my leg." As he crossed the room to sit down, I noticed a heavy smell of whiskey and wondered if I had anything to fear. He rolled up the leg of his jeans and removed a dirty piece of rag to expose an appalling gash on his leg. I gasped. "You must see a doctor at once," I said. "That wound should be stitched." "Haven't you got any iodine?" he asked. "Oh," I said, "I could not put iodine on to an open wound like that." "Why not?" he asked. "It would hurt too much." "I guess it would hurt you more than it would hurt me," he said. "Go ahead. Throw on the whole bottle. I can take it." But I had no iodine. I took a roll of bandage and knelt at his feet, wrapping the bandage over and over as well as I could. When I had finished, I stood up and went over to open the door. His spirited horse was hitched to my gate post. "I'm sorry I cannot do any more for you," I said. "Good night." Johnny staggered to the door, lingered a moment, and then went out. I bolted the door after him and then went back to bed. As I fell asleep, I heard the thud of his horse's hoofs as he galloped round and round the house. The next morning in school, I asked the children, "Did you know Johnny Grinder had had an accident?" And they replied, "Who? Little Johnny? Sure. His horse threw him into a fence a couple of nights ago." "A couple of nights ago," I said. "Are you sure?" And they said, "Yes, Joe is taking him into the hospital in Ashcroft tomorrow." I heard later that the doctor had to put 11 stitches in the wound. But little Johnny was not my only late-night caller during those early days. It seemed as though people found it difficult to accept the fact that I was prepared to live in that valley and live alone, solely for the purpose of teaching school. One night, very late, when I was just about to retire, I was suddenly startled by the glare of headlights flashing onto my windows. I had not heard a car come down to the door. It must have made the bumpy trip from the roads with its lights out and the engine shut off. I opened my door and saw a gleaming new car with a man at the wheel, a stranger. "Is it too late for a social call?" he asked, and I answered, "Oh no." I was pleased to have some society. Besides, I remembered Nick's injunction that I must at least offer a cup of coffee to any visitors before they embarked on the long journey back to town. I did not know where the man had come from, but he must be received with hospitality, so I said cheerfully, "Come in." My new friend walked inside, doffing his Stetson, and planted a brown paper parcel on the table. "There you are," he said. "Never been opened." "What is it?" I asked. "It's a bottle of whiskey," he replied. "Whiskey," I said. "What for?" He looked at me for a moment, then passing his tongue round his mouth, as though savoring the liquor, he said dryly. "Some folks drink the stuff." "Well, I don't," I said, not with the intention of offering a rebuke, but because I was astonished that he had come with such an odd gift. The parcel stood unopened on the table between us, while he sat there and talked for an hour or more, and I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. When he left, he took the bottle with him. Even the children seemed to be puzzled by the fact that I lived alone. "You ought to have a man living with you to chop your wood and carry your water," they said, and they discussed openly the eligibility of various members of their families, some of whom would be hanging round the door when afternoon school was out. At last I told them that I appreciated their interest in my welfare, but that although I should be delighted to have help with my wood chopping, I could not impose on other women's husbands, and in any case there was not room in my little house for more than one person. Their reaction was prompt and resourceful as always. For the next few days they were occupied with building operations on a structure between my house and the school. When they had roofed it, they pulled nails out of old planks and hammered pieces of wood together to make stools and a table. I said encouragingly, as I passed one day, "I like your playhouse very much." "That's not a playhouse," they exclaimed. "Well, what is it?" I asked. "It's a house for Manny to sleep in when he comes to stay with you," they replied. They frequently questioned me about my visitors. I assumed at first that they were checking up on their big brothers, but then it occurred to me that maybe they were checking up on me. One Monday morning, Michael leaned nonchalantly against my doorpost and said, "So, you had 2 men to see you yesterday." "Did I?" I asked. He was quite right. "Sure," said Michael. "How do you know?" I said. He opened his hand and showed me 2 cigarette stubs which he had picked up on my doorstep. He knew I did not smoke. "Well," said I, "can't one man smoke 2 cigarettes?" "They're different brands," said Michael. As the seasons passed, I discovered for myself that a woman in this valley did need a man. It was not a question of the superiority of one sex over the other, but rather of the interdependence imposed by the primitive setting. Here the sexes were truly complementary. If a man quarreled with his wife and she left him, he had to have another woman from somewhere to take charge of his home while he did the heavy outdoor work. There was no extra bedroom for her to sleep in. If a man deserted his wife, she had to go and be cook to another man in order to get the means to exist. There was thus, in some cases, a loose arrangement of relationships. I could not bring myself to condemn the way of living as immoral. These people had a different heritage from mine, and their rules of conduct might derive from a tradition where such relationships were acceptable. On the other hand, I believed in the rightness of the moral standards to which I subscribed sincerely enough to wish to hand them on to my pupils. The Christian principles which I hoped to transmit to them must be inherent in my own way of living. Any laxness on my part would discredit my faith in their eyes. These children had so few outside contacts that it was inevitable that a newcomer would be an object of comment. Children in civilization have an opportunity to assimilate their values from many sources in the many daily contacts they make, but these children had perhaps not met a comparable situation before. The only unattached female among their people was Kitty Ann, an aged Indian woman who rode down the valley from time to time on a white horse. She had no man to fend for her, and she still shot her own deer and chopped her own wood. It was apparent that the children had problems. However, one afternoon I was sitting beside Viva, correcting her English exercise. There was a whispered conversation going on beside the window, and Floyd suddenly turned round and asked, "Where do babies come from, Miss Taylor?" I assumed that this was a question designed to test my response, rather than a genuine request for information. "Who told you to ask me that question, Floyd?" I asked. "Douglas," said Floyd, and a ripple of amusement went round the class. Viva said, "Babies come from God, don't they, Miss Taylor?" And I replied, "Yes," and left the matter for the moment. As I went on with the marking, I was thinking round the subject. I recalled that someone had told me that Minnie Dunn was about to have a baby. Douglas lived in the same house. Perhaps he really was troubled about it. At break, Douglas was chopping wood, so as I passed the wood pile, I smiled at him and said, "Well, Douglas, where do babies come from?" He looked up at me and answered, "I don't know." So I said, Viva was right when she said that babies come from God, because all life comes from God. A baby grows from a seed. Part of the seed is in the father, and part is in the mother, and during the first few months of life, it grows safe and comfortable in the mother's body. Then it is born. I waited a moment and then asked, "Any more questions?" "No," said Douglas, and returned to his wood chopping. I could only hope that that explanation would suffice for the present. I could not believe that these children, living so close to nature, were unaware of the facts of mating and birth. They played riotous games on the mountainside, enacting the activities of the ranch, straddling long slender willow wands with a tuft of leaves left on at the end. They galloped about, lashing their fringed string tails in one hand behind them. When I rang the school bell, they would come streaming in with merry laughter, saying, for instance, "We only branded the girls, but we branded and cut, castrated the boys." I did not like to think that perhaps human parenthood meant no more to them than the mating of mare and stallion. If enlightenment was needed, it was my job to provide it, but any moral training that I gave would be based on Christian principles. The source of these is the Bible, and I was forbidden to expound the scriptures. The School Children of Big Bar Creek, 1948. The Children of Henry and Annie. Marjorie, 13 years. grade 8. Ralph, 10 years, grade 4. Viva, 8 years, grade 3. Floyd, 6 years, grade 1. The children of Old Johnny and Melanie. Fred, 14 years, grade 5. Minnie, 11 years, grade 3. Arthur, 9 years, grade 2. The children of Alfie and Anna. Peter, 14 years, grade 4. Edgar, 12 years, grade 5. Douglas, 9 years, grade 2. Dick, 7 years, grade 1. And from the same house, the son of Minnie Dunn, Michael, 11 years, grade 4. Also attending until Christmas from the Circle H Ranch, Philip, 13 years, grade 7. Chapter 3. Halloween and Thanksgiving. I was now beginning to have some idea of the type of children I had to deal with. Their chief quality was their courage. Life was hard for them, but I never heard them grumble. They all had to get up early in the morning, especially the Higginbottoms, who lived so far up the valley. Before setting out for school, they must fetch water from the creek for the day's needs. If it was wash day, so much the worse. They had wood to chop and animals to feed, their horses to catch and saddle, their lunches to prepare. When they reached school, the bigger boys had more chores, chopping wood for the school stove, lighting the fire, filling the water pitcher. The younger ones would come and sit in my house, and I used to display some new article sometimes, to see if they would notice it. They never failed the test. All of them were very observant, and their comments quite uninhibited. "Gee, that's a little coffee pot," they would say. "Where'd you get it?" Or, "Mom's got a wooden spoon just like that." Or, "Scrubbed your floor, huh?" Or, "What did you put those weeds on the table for?" Wild flowers were all weeds to them. There was a majority of males in the valley of about 3 to 1. Alfie's family were all boys, except the 3 and 4-year-olds, and since one woman could not cope with all the domestic duties for such a houseful, the boys had to be adept not only at washing up and cooking, but at sewing on buttons and scrubbing floors. After school, in the afternoons, they had to hurry home to their work on the ranch, seeding, hoeing, digging potatoes. Labor seemed to be provided communally for work on their own ranches. Seed could not be planted before the middle of May because of snow and frost. But once the spring had come, the rate of growth was rapid, and there would be haymaking before the end of June. The season traveled up the valley, and the youths followed it, knowing that they would receive at least board and lodging for their help, and stabling, if necessary, for their horses, and that the help would be reciprocated when their own family needed it. In November, they would still be haying on top of the mountain. Besides hay, they grew potatoes and root crops, corn and cabbages and onions and oats. Down by the river, melons, tomatoes, and cucumber would ripen, and the orchards were rich with apples and pears and crab apples, and peach plums and prune plums. During July and August, while the men were busy in the fields, the women and girls were picking fruit and bottling and canning. The wild berries were plentiful, Saskatoon berries, which the children called alali berries, blueberries, choke cherries, and Husham berries, and the mountain sides were covered with wild strawberries. During my first week, Douglas brought me a bottle of what looked like tomato ketchup, and invited me to drink it. He said it was the juice of the Husham berry, and recommended it highly. I tasted it and hid a grimace. It tasted of quinine. I said I would put it away until I was really thirsty, and I set it on a shelf under my table. A few days later, the cork blew out halfway across the kitchen, but a delicious confection could be made from a handful of the berries. You put them into a deep bowl with a tablespoonful of water, pressed them with the back of the spoon to squeeze out all the juice, and then whipped up the mixture with an egg whisk, added sugar and perhaps a little flavoring, and had a very satisfying meal. The froth whipped up higher and higher. I would add a few wild strawberries to make it pink. When it came to working for the white rancher, the people were not so industrious. The rancher's complaint was that he could not depend on them. Just when he was at his busiest, one of them would come with a story about having to take his mother into the town to the hospital, and the rancher, if he was inexperienced, would advance the man's pay so that he could produce the necessary taxi fare, with the injunction to him to return himself the next morning. Usually, the Indian would not turn up again for a week or more, having had a spree in town. For the natives, money was a commodity that was hard to come by. When young Alfie had to come out to the valley for the winter, he left his horse in town. In the spring, he went back to the town to work for 3 months to pay for his horse's keep. The Indians also kept cattle. At the time of the cattle sales, these were driven for 40 miles to be shipped for beef. At such times, and after the hunters had been in the valley, the people had plenty of money. Then they could lay in a supply of foodstuffs from town. Dick came to school one day and said, "Dad came home in a truck last night with $700 worth of groceries, and all the bills said thank you." It was a couple of weeks after the beginning of term before Pete put in an appearance. I watched him as he came towards my cabin door, a slim, leisurely lad with an oval, olive-colored face and almond-shaped eyes. His face was expressionless. I could not decide whether this was due to reserve and secrecy, or whether he was of a passive disposition. I soon found that he had a somewhat puckish sense of humor. I had written on the blackboard, "Handwriting, preparatory to a lesson to the little ones on the subject." Peter stood up, politely indicating that he wished to say something. "Is there such a thing as foot writing?" he asked. I had been worried that morning because I had had difficulty over the water. Water from the creek for my domestic needs flowed through an irrigation ditch into a wooden box-shaped pipe from which it flowed directly into my pail. It was easier and less dangerous for me to put my pail under the spout of water than to lower it into the waters of the creek. Nick had warned me that as winter approached, ice would form at the entrance to the ditch, and my pipe would cease to flow. Then I should have to go right down to the creek for water. This morning I had found the irrigation ditch dry, and I was puzzled. It was too early in the year for ice. Pete was my oldest pupil, so I appealed to him. "Will you have a look at my irrigation ditch," I said to him, "and see if you can find out why the water has dried up?" "Sure," said Pete, and he went off down the trail. In a few minutes he was back again. "Want me to fix it?" he said. "Can you fix it?" I asked. "Sure. Got a shovel?" He took the spade and the axe with him, and I did not see him again that morning. Well, I asked for it, I thought. I suppose he's lying on his back somewhere in the sun. When afternoon school was over and the children had gone home, I took my pails down the trail and found, to my great satisfaction, that the water in the irrigation ditch was flowing abundantly. Putting my pails down, I went to see how the problem had been solved. I followed the course of the ditch right back to the creek, struggling through the undergrowth as well as I could. Apparently, the water had been escaping down side channels. Pete had cut down a tree to block one channel and built a wall of mud across another, so raising the level of water in my ditch to a point at which the flow could be resumed. It seemed to me that this use of his knowledge was more significant as a guide to his intelligence than were the results of artificial standardized tests, which had no reference to his background. I never knew where Pete was living. He had spent the summer months working with his mother, Anna, picking fruit in the Okanagan Valley. Anna was separated from Alfie, and Pete did not stay in Alfie's household, as his brothers did. He was mobile, since he had a horse which was exclusively his, a fleet, little beast referred to by Pete as his strawberry roan. Fred, my other teenage boy, also had his own horse. I knew that these boys loved their horses, but Fred made a very revealing remark on one occasion. I was talking about values in life, and I said, "What might a man love more than he loved God?" expecting someone to reply, "Money or power." Fred said promptly, "His horse." Fred was late in starting the term because he had been out with the hunters. The hunting season opened on September 1st, and Johnny and his family of boys were in great demand as guides. Though Fred was only 14 years old, he knew how to track game. His first composition read, "In my summer holidays, I went hunting across the river. The first 3 days we never saw anything, and on the 4th day we got a moose. On the 5th day we got a deer and a moose. It snowed 1 inch. Then tracking was easy, and we saw 8 does. His mother Melanie, who was pure Indian, was determined that Fred should have book learning too, and so he came reluctantly to school. I felt that he had much to offer in recounting his own native knowledge, and took pains to give him the means of expression. To me, one horse was much the same as another, but to the children they were as different as people. They could identify them by name when they were just mere specks on the mountainside. Somebody looking out of the window in school would say, "There's Joe going up Big Bar Mountain," and if I asked, "How do you know it's Joe?" the answer would be, "I can tell him by his horse." When they rode to school, they would generally leave the horse free to graze, since if they put him in the barn, they would need hay for him. When they came out of school to go home, they would scan the slopes for their mount, and often have to cross the creek and take a long walk up the mountain to catch him. I found this new environment a stimulating professional challenge. What ought to be my aim in setting out to teach these children? There was no question of preparing them for a competitive scholarship examination, or of equipping them for occupation in industry. In this remote valley, the educational system could be a purely cultural one, devised to enable life to be lived at its best. My basic aim would be to make the children articulate, to train them to think, and enable them to communicate their thoughts. But fluency of thought is only achieved in conditions of freedom. The rigid demands of a program of studies might prove an obstacle. The children were already too much accustomed to work under direction, distrusting their own initiative. They demanded to know how many spellings to learn, how many pages to read, how many sums to work, instead of going on as far as they could. The 2 grade 2 children, repeating the work a second time, were really retarded. Arthur, aged 9, was a replica of his brother Fred. Very shy in class, he spoke seldom, and if I asked him a question, replied jerkily, as briefly as possible. He was in a complete muddle about arithmetic, though he could read. Douglas was a most endearing little boy, chiefly on account of the charming smile which lit up his features from time to time. He was very practical, very independent, and full of ideas. He was also naughty, in that he rebelled against authority. I was surprised to find that he could not write one word, though he could read haltingly. I decided that what was needed with Douglas was a focal point of interest, and this I found by accident. For the last period of the afternoon, I would often read to the children while they drew pictures of their life and interest in their scribblers. I was debating what I should read to follow Uncle Tom's Cabin, when someone lent me a copy of the tall tales about Paul Bunyan, the giant logger. These seemed to me to be just the right sort of folk tales for Canadian children, and I tried them on my pupils. The stories were much appreciated, especially by Pete, Michael, and Douglas. One day Douglas surprised me by announcing that he was going to write a composition, and he set about it forthwith. He was a little boy who tackled his difficulties with determination. He followed me round, asking every other minute, "How do you spell?" and then making his own suggestion as to how to spell the word, which was generally right. His composition turned out to be a reproduction of one of the Paul Bunyan stories, the one in which Paul's wife comes to the logging camp to visit him and drops her false teeth in the lake, and Paul rescues them for her by lowering a roast chicken into the water so that the teeth bite on it and are brought up to the surface. Arthur was always fiddling with a pencil, but if I strolled down the room past his desk, he would cover up his work with his arms and blush to his ears. One day I gently removed his arms and saw that he was drawing a scene with horses with such sensitivity and skill that I sought for a bigger surface for him to work on. There were no large sheets of paper in the school, but in my house the wall between the kitchen and the bedroom was covered with cream paper. One afternoon I invited Arthur to paint a picture on this wall to show me what life in the valley was like at his home. I left him there with a tiny paint box containing 4 colors and 2 thin little brushes. When I went into my house after school, the result took my breath away. Dick was 7 years old. On the very first day of school, I looked across from the windows of my house at lunchtime and was horrified to see Dick at the wood pile with the axe. I dared not shout to him for fear of precipitating the accident that I feared would happen. So I stepped outside and called to Edgar, his elder brother. "Can you get the axe from Dick?" I asked in a half-whisper. Edgar looked at me. "Sure," he said. "Do you want it?" "Oh, I don't want it," I said, but I thought he might hurt himself. Edgar laughed. "Well, he has to chop the kindling at home," he said. So Dick and even Floyd continued to use the little hand axe. They were very sensible in its use. They liked to chop piles of kindling from which they would make model corrals and ranch buildings. Dick was a Higginbottom, and thus practical-minded, slower in response than Floyd, because he considered a matter from all angles before making a comment. Floyd's drawings revealed the vitality and spontaneity of his mind, and he was liable to come out with any sort of remark. The strange thing was that he found great difficulty in learning to read. He could write a little composition, while he was still struggling with the pre-primers in reading. Both these children in grade 1 took easily to arithmetic. I ordered some cards for teaching number combinations, which were like dominoes, and the 2 little boys worked many sums with these. One day Dick came out and asked if they could have the box of cardboard money. I gave it to him and went on with the lesson I was giving to some of the others. After a time, pleased with the application with which the grade 1 pupils were working, I commended their industry to the rest of the class. Just then Floyd called out in a piping little voice, "Miss Taylor, I won $2. "Won," I said, puzzled, while the class burst out laughing. "They're gambling," said Edgar. Michael was harder to understand than the other boys were. He was one of the sons of Minnie Dunn, who was acting as housekeeper to Alfie Higginbottom. He and his mother came from the Pacific coast, and were of a different tribe from the others, and it was obvious that Michael felt his isolation. He was not so ready to share as were the others. He worked in a different way, finding it necessary to leave his seat frequently and stroll round to Ralph or Pete, who were in the same grade. I watched this restlessness, wondering if he went to find out the answers to his sums, but the children were all much too independent to cheat. They even resented it if I helped them with their work. All they needed was that I should explain the method to them and then leave them to work it out. I found, finally, that the best stimulant to Michael was to achieve an A. After that, he would work like a house on fire. He was mischievous, too, like Pete, but his mischief tended to have a little malice in it sometimes. He was very sensitive, cloaking it by an appearance of being hard-boiled. When I had occasion to chastise him, I would give him the added punishment of fetching me a pail of water from the creek, so that his tears could be spent down there and not before the others. He was very slow in everything he did, and at first he produced nothing artistic. This was perhaps partly because he was always too much absorbed in the story I was reading while they sketched. The others would be busily scribbling away, while Michael sat wide-eyed, waiting for the denouement of the story. One afternoon, while I was reading, there seemed to be something going on at Pete's desk. The other children gradually left their own seats and congregated there. As they were quiet and appeared busy, I made no comment, but at the end of the period I said, "What have you all been doing?" And they brought forward a corporate model which they had been making out of plasticine and bits of twigs and corrugated paper from the chalk box, and so on. It represented a log house with corral, horses and cattle, duck pond and ducks, squirrels and dogs and cats. The ducks were the corpses of blue bottle flies they had found on the window sill. One dog carried a duck in its mouth. I was so delighted with the spontaneity and vitality of this model that I promptly ordered clay in powder form, and thenceforth they spent their odd minutes modeling clay horses, the best of which I kept in my cabin on a special shelf, which went all round my walls. The procession of clay figures, unfortunately not fired, thus streaming round my walls, gave me much pleasure. Ralph was a year younger than Michael, but in the same grade with Michael and Pete. He was weak in reading, like his little brother Floyd. This was partly because he found it necessary to mouth the spelling of a new word before he could pronounce it, He considered that since Dad, who had only had 3 years of schooling in his life, was now able to beat the teacher, it was highly unnecessary for him to waste the best years of his life at school. But under an assumption of indifference, he was anxious to do well. His failures at times were due to the nervous excitability of his temperament, but he had to a marked degree that spontaneity of expression which I was so keen to preserve in these children. His little clay horses seemed to be alive, tossing their manes in the wind, or lying contentedly in the sunshine, or galloping down the mountain. Once, in my ignorance, I ventured to criticize one of his horses. I thought it looked a little short in the back. The artist in him was outraged. "No," he exclaimed indignantly, "that's a young stallion, and he's showing off to his old woman." Viva and Minnie were in grade 3. Viva was only 8 years old. She was intelligent and capable, and had a mind of her own. Given the right training and environment, she would have made an excellent teacher. In view of the scarcity of women in the valley, she was more likely to become a mother. She would ride round to see me after school. She rode bareback, and was always ready to offer me a ride. The first time she did this, I thought to myself, if an 8-year-old can ride without a saddle, so can I. So I accepted her offer. I found the mare's back very round and very slippery, but I kept my seat successfully as she ambled across the sage. As soon as she came to the road, she broke into a canter, and I sprawled in the dust. The horse stopped at once and looked round at me as much as to say, "What on earth are you doing down there?" After this, I was aware of my own limitations and did not venture to ride without a saddle. Minnie was a lovely girl, pretty to look at, with dark eyes, tanned cheeks, and long, silky black hair. She was old for her grade, because she had had to miss attendances through ill health, having been at one time under observation for tuberculosis. She was not so quick at her schoolwork as either Viva or Marjorie, but she was artistic, like her little brother, Arthur. Minnie was the only one of my pupils at Big Bar Creek with whom I could feel that my affection was reciprocated. The others seemed to set out to emphasize that there was a gulf between us, whether because I was English, or because I was white, or merely because I was the school teacher, I did not know. I always hoped that a relationship of confidence would be established between us, but the boys, especially, maintained an attitude of indifference. Marjorie as the head girl, but this was of no significance to her. Loyalty to the school, which is such a feature of the English educational tradition, was a concept outside the experience of these children. Nobody coveted the job of monitor. When I asked for volunteers to clean the blackboard daily, the first point to be settled was how much pay was offered for doing it. This took me by surprise, but I was much more shocked later when finding that the school regulations required that the flag, at that time the Union Jack, should be hoisted every day school was in session. I asked who would like to undertake the task. "How much do we get for it?" they asked. And I said angrily that if they were not proud to be given the honor of hoisting their country's flag, I would do it myself. But whenever visitors were coming to the school, I could always depend on Marjorie to work thoroughly and unobtrusively to make the school look as nice as possible. The boys carried the water from the creek, but Marjorie bore the main brunt of the scrubbing and mopping that school floor was no light job, especially in winter. Marjorie never left her work in the middle to go out and have fun. It was the same on the night of the party. She was a most courteous hostess, handing round sandwiches and cakes and coffee, and seemingly taking no thought for herself. What I found disappointing was that she would not accept responsibility in school, and she was apt to come out with remarks to the effect that her father was going to take her away from Big Bar Creek and send her to a proper school in the town. Edgar was more white in appearance than the other Higginbottoms, and had the family characteristic of a sense of humor. His interests, however, were more white-collar than any of the other children's. It was his ambition to work in the store at Jesmond, as he was in grade 5, at the age of 12. He was of average ability, and there was no reason why he should not achieve his aim. As the days became shorter, and the outdoor work had to cease early in the evening, I began to have visitors, lads who welcomed a way to kill time and a chance to look me over. My most regular visitors were Cecil and young Alfie, not Alfie Higginbottom, and they would experiment with my typewriter and drink coffee while I marked books. If I had time to talk, I would tell them about England, or ask them to tell me stories of their hunting adventures. I showed them my photograph album, in which I had pasted pictures of people in the valley. Some of these I had labeled cowboys, and some Indians. In school, about this time, I became aware of an undercurrent of antagonism. Remarks would be made with regard to crazy Englishmen, and little Dick surprised me by saying that if he went to England, he would shoot every Englishman he saw. At last I said, "What is the matter, children?" There was a hostile silence. Then Viva said, "You called us Indians." I remembered the photograph album. I did not know how I had transgressed. "Well, you are Indians," I said. "We're white," they all replied. "But you are part Indian," I said. "We're white," they repeated. If I were part Indian, I said with some heat, I should be proud of it. "We are, but we're white," they insisted. I then told them that English children thought Indian children were wonderful, and that my former pupils in England were thrilled to hear about them and their skill with horses and as hunters. I told them that no children I had ever taught had had the gifts that they had. Their clay horses, for instance, were creations of beauty. Their independence and resourcefulness filled me with admiration. They had a knowledge of woodcraft and natural history which it would take a city boy a lifetime to acquire, and in time we became friends again. I had had evidence of their resourcefulness in the way they dealt with and solved problems which entirely balked my superior intelligence. The first time I wanted to refill the fount of my gasoline lamp, I found, to my annoyance, that the only funnel I possessed was too thick in the stem to go into the opening. Ralph was passing, and he said, conversationally, "Filling your lamp." "I can't fill it," I said. "The funnel is too big." Ralph tried the funnel and then said, "Got a pitcher?" I fetched the only jug I had. This was also too big in the spout, and he discarded it. He looked round, saw an empty tin can, which I had put outside for disposal, fetched the axe from the wood pile, hammered the lip of the can into a narrow spout with the back of the axe, and filled my lamp with ease. I had had to ask the school board for 1 or 2 desks, as there were none big enough for my older boys. These came out on the stage truck and suffered in their switchback journey, one of them getting broken. The cast iron leg was in 2 pieces. This was a nuisance, as it would take so long to get another. "Want me to fix it?" asked Pete, and I replied, "Now, Pete, you can't mend cast iron." "Sure we can," said Pete, and he and Fred proceeded to make a splint out of thick wood and bind it to the broken part of the leg with some thick fence wire, which they hammered right into the wood. Fred held the blade of the axe flat underneath while Pete hammered against it. In spite of their insistence that they were white, the children of Big Bar Creek had at least one quality which was an obvious inheritance from their Indian forebears. That was the capacity to disappear. Out of doors, of course, they could merge into the landscape in the blink of an eye, yet even indoors they could efface themselves in a way that mystified me. One day I was sitting in front of the class, with Floyd standing by my left side, while I helped him with his reading. Ralph came out from his desk with a question about the problem he was working, and when I turned back to Floyd, he had disappeared. I looked towards Floyd's desk. He was not there. I looked behind me. He was not there. "Did Floyd go out?" I asked, and Michael answered, "Maybe." I waited a while and got on with something else. Then I sent Douglas to the toilet to tell Floyd to hurry up. He came back and said, "He's not there." "Well, where is he?" I asked. "Under your desk," suggested Arthur. I looked there in vain. The class was quietly enjoying the joke. "Now where is he?" I demanded at last, and Floyd came out from behind the waste paper basket. One afternoon, when all the windows were open wide, there came a knock at the door, and I went to answer it. I stepped outside for a moment to speak to the messenger, and when I went indoors, the room was empty. I assumed that the children had gone out through the windows, and I took the bell and rang it vigorously. Then they all emerged from behind cupboards and under desks. On another occasion, 4 of the boys failed to come back into school after the morning break. When assured that they were not down by the creek, I searched the room for them. In one dark corner there was a homemade table with a shelf underneath it. I barely glanced at this, knowing that if anyone was hidden there, his feet would show. At last I ordered the boys to come out from their hiding place, and the 4 of them tumbled out from under the table, where they had been folded together like jackknives. But when Pete disappeared before my very eyes, I began to feel that the joke was being carried too far. The children were busy on various activities out of doors, and Pete had undertaken to make a mailbox for me, so that if the school trustee or anyone with a message for the school was passing by on the road, they could leave a note in the box instead of coming all the way down to the school. With his usual resourcefulness, he had ensured the completion of the box when I had taken it for granted that it could not be finished. He wanted hinges for the lid, but I had no hinges. Had I a piece of leather, perhaps? No, I had no leather. So he went across to a deserted shack, rummaged in the rubbish till he found a worn-out moccasin, cut strips out of the moose hide of which it was made, and used them for hinges. After he had returned, I was standing outside the school door while he was working at a carpenter's bench just inside. He put his head out of the open door and said, "I've finished the mailbox, Miss Taylor." I said, "Right, Pete, I'll come and look at it," and I went into the school. The finished box was on the bench, and I exclaimed with pleasure, but there was no sign of Pete. I looked behind the few pieces of furniture, but he was nowhere to be seen. He could not have gone out through the windows without being seen by me. I looked round again. I began to have a funny feeling down my spine. Then I looked up. Pete was balancing on the narrow edge of the open door, crouching like an Indian ancestor who might have been hiding from a pale face. The upturned corners of his mouth and the slant of his almond eyes indicated his delight in the success of his trick. I was happy to find that with such a small group one could run the school as a mother runs her family, allowing freedom of movement and of conversation during recreative lessons, and requiring silence only when the child or his neighbor was working on something demanding concentration. My fundamental aim was to enable the children to express their ideas fluently, and I began by encouraging the drawing of pictures. At first, they wanted to be directed, and would ask how much to measure and what to draw. I introduced pattern so that they could enjoy using color, and they would ask, "What color should I do the middle bit?" or "How many times shall I repeat this row?" And I would answer, "Well, what color do you think goes well with the border? Or are you going to put anything between the rows?" encouraging them to use their own judgment. I was still rather worried about the program of studies. I wanted to be loyal to the educational system under which I was serving, but I was not sure that in following the recommendations of the guide to the curriculum, I should be opening the door to a fuller life for these particular children. At last I wrote to the Department of Education in Victoria, stating my views and asking if I was proceeding on the right lines. I was much relieved to receive the following letter from the Assistant Superintendent of Education. Dear Miss Taylor, I have read your letter with interest and admiration for your insight into the part which environment plays in equipping a child to score highly on the ordinary scholastic test. You are very right in ignoring the results of the ordinary intelligence test and in providing materials of instruction which take into consideration the backgrounds of your pupils and their needs. After this, I could carry on with my own ideas and principles with a clear conscience. During the lovely autumn afternoons, the children would suggest work that could be done out of doors, and if their suggestions were sensible and constructive, I would give them freedom to implement them. They were full of ideas. Some would fill old pails with sand from a shallow patch of the creek and carry it up to make an outdoor sand table for Floyd and Dick. Some were making a garden. The tumbleweed was getting out of hand and needed attention. And there was much else to be done. Douglas brought up violet roots from the banks of the creek and planted them on the north side of my cabin, then built an elaborate snow shed over them. Some of the boys gathered up the old tin cans, which littered the site, and flattened them ready for burial. We were still troubled in school by the pack rats. The boys insisted that we must set traps in order to get rid of them. They played havoc with school materials. Anything left uncovered was in danger. Chalks would be carried off, erasers, pencils, even scissors, and in their place we would find little heaps of dead matches, or bits of old orange peel, or stale bread from under the floorboards. If I put a bowl of rose hips and autumn leaves on my desk, it would be despoiled overnight, stripped right down to the level of the water, and the debris scattered all over the place. The first time we set a trap, it disappeared. Michael found it a few days later, down in the bush. It contained a rat's leg. Next time, we nailed the trap to the floor. Again, we caught nothing but a rat's leg. At this, I forbade the children to set the trap again, but Edgar said he knew a method by which we could catch the whole rat. He spread newspaper inside the trap because he said rats like to walk on newspaper, and he laid a piece of stove pipe leading towards the trap because rats like running through tunnels. The next morning, the thrice-caught rat was sitting in the trap alive, held by a hind leg. The boys opened the trap, and the rat made a hideous bid for freedom, darting out and trying to run on its two hind legs. The front legs were merely stumps. After that, we had a different routine. The boys set the trap before leaving school in the afternoon. Then a few minutes after dark, I went across to the school with my torch, carrying also a lump of wood. The rat, newly caught, would be struggling in the trap, and it was my job to hit it until it was dead. It took me some time afterwards to calm my revolting stomach, and I left the carcass to be disposed of by the boys in the morning.